Hey, so my name is Issachar Lane. I'm an analyst, lifelong career. Come from a family of, ironically, financial people. So my mom's a tax lawyer, my dad was an accountant, and of course engineers as well. So it's kind of with my grandpa and other ones, but it's kind of funny how I fell into this. I don't do financial analysis, though some of this stuff probably is going to get into the world of financial analysis, depending on your questions, of course. So, I'm not going to talk too much about myself because that's not the point of this. So, certainly an individual's charisma and characteristics of people certainly draw in better in the audience spectrum. But so, in my last video, I asked you all to give me a question, right? I wanted to be able to create a dialogue, if you will, over like a podcast service. I don't have, the time. I don't have the energy to necessarily sit down and deal with people's bullshit, quite frankly, when it comes to a consistent amount of engagement, right? So like, for instance, a co-host for a podcast now, sitting down and doing an interview for someone for certain is something I'm interested in. But realistically, I prefer kind of a more free flow where I'm not having to deal with people's emotional whatever problems. And I feel like it's so hard to find someone that you don't have, some personality conflicts that you have to do this with. So I look at this more, not necessarily Joe Rogan-esque, but I find his method of, he hosts, he's the lead, and then he has a guest on, right? Can't do that. So instead, you give me a question and I'll find an answer. So taking that into account, what does that even mean, right? What answers am I going to give? So like, how can I just randomly ask, who the heck am I, right? So I wanted to start this off. I'm going to do a kind of a 4-part series. So this first part, we're going to discuss, a question I had, and then kind of how that question evolved as I did research, and eventually, some of the solutions that I came up with based on the stats. So, the original question, and this is a conversation I had a couple years back when I first tried podcasting, was healthcare for all. That was the discussion. So me personally, is full disclosure, I feel like I feel like we need to be more liberal with our application of things, i.e. there's some changes that are necessary within our government to be able to make considerable steps. So I think that the problems that we have right now are going to require some pretty liberal solutions, just because we've been so conservative over the last 40 years, since Reagan, really. In fact, I might even do a piece about my thoughts on Reagan, but I am not a Dem. I'm going to preface this. I don't like either party. I am more Dem-leaning, but fundamentally, I think that both parties have kind of failed us as a people. But that's not the point of this conversation. The point is to kind of give you some characterization of where I'm at. I think that's really relevant when you're talking about questions and how you arrive at answers, right? So, anyways, conservative friend and I were doing a podcast on healthcare. So when I went into the research portion of this podcast, I was like, okay, well, all right, how do we get universal healthcare? Like, what's the cost and all this stuff? So I was looking, and the very first thing I discovered is that in 2016, the U.S. as a whole, right, not federal, like the entire U.S. system spent $3.337 trillion on healthcare. I read that. I went, that's a lot of money. And I went, I feel like we're probably spending enough money on our healthcare system. Like, we have the total GDP of, or excuse, that was 17% of our entire GDP is spent on healthcare. 17%. Like, I know people complain about military expenditures, but holy crap. Um, it's not even close, right? That is a significant amount of money. Why? So now it became, what's wrong with $3.337 trillion, or what's wrong with the medical system that costs us that much, and we already don't get this healthcare, right? We have, at the time, we had 350 million people. Like, it just was insane. So almost instantly, I had to go back and go, okay, wait, what are all these expenditures on? Like, how are we looking at this? Like, what? So the question morphed from free healthcare to what's wrong with our healthcare system and how do we make it work, right? So started doing a lot more research, right? So just some preface there. In 2019, the U.S. federally spent $1.2 trillion on healthcare, direct healthcare. Well, yeah. Anyways, pretty direct towards healthcare. So of that 3.337 trillion, the federal government paid $1.2 trillion. There is additional kind of characterization I think that's relevant here. There's also the National Institute of Health spent $37 billion that year on healthcare, right? And then there was an additional $33 billion paid towards healthcare research, and that sort of thing via charitable donations. And I think that charitable donations, especially because they come out of our they're tax free, effectively comes out of the U.S. federal government's revenue stream. So $1.2 trillion and some change the U.S. federal government spent. Now, mind you, that's $1.2 trillion of a $4.45 trillion budget that same year. So our budget that year was that much. Like, so we can clearly see a direct connection, right? Almost 25% of our entire budget goes towards medical. Now, I will say that that doesn't necessarily include the federal employees' medical and a lot of that data. So more the data specifically covers only Medicare, Medicaid, Veterans Health Care, and Affordable Care Act subsidies. Additionally, the federal government spends, going back to that $4.45 trillion, pays $2.3 trillion, or paid $2.3 trillion a year towards federal employees. And of course, those fees as well reflect additional costs. So it's probably in medical care. If we just took the 17% of the GDP that it was the $3.337 trillion we spent that year on medical care, if we took that same inference of the 17%, that's another almost $500 billion that the U.S. federal government forked over towards healthcare, totaling over. And again, that $500 billion is just an assessment, a corollary, right? It could be upper or lower of that, but it's just a rough guesstimate. So the 1.2 for sure, and then probably $1.7 trillion of our total $4.45 trillion budget went towards healthcare expenditures. So we're paying enough. What's wrong? What needs to be fixed? Where are all these costs coming from? What the heck is going on, right? So kind of came to three conclusions with it. So in no particular order. I was doing some more digging, right? Obesity is a huge part of those expenditures. Pharmaceuticals, and then another element that may be not considered in the money side of it, but there's an issue with our doctors, right? Not our training per se, but And the first two, or excuse me, at least the obesity absolutely aggravates this third issue. So try and keep these short-ish. Try and keep these, to a point. I can definitely rant and ramble, and I want to make sure that I give you, the best possible information. So see you next time, next video. Looking forward to kind of discussing this for our very first problem set. Have a good one.